This is a 1999 Lotus Esprit V8, and it's cool. Mid-engine, manual transmission, wedge styling, very rare. If this was a Ferrari or a Lamborghini, it would be worth zillions. But it's a Lotus, so it's not. Most people don't know what this is, and the ones who do think it's going to break all the time. Today, I'm going to review the Esprit V8 and show you all of its quirks and features. Before I get started, big news, this Esprit is currently for sale, being auctioned live on Cars and Bids, which is my enthusiast car auction website. This is a twin-turbo V8 Esprit with around 30,000 miles in a cool color with only 2 owners, and you can buy it on Cars and Bids. So, once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to head over to the live auction for this Esprit V8, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. Alright, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the Esprit V8 with undoubtedly its best feature, and that would be the V8, which was a big deal, especially for Lotus, because Lotus was all about making small, lightweight cars and then putting small engines in them because that was all they needed for big speed since the cars were so small. It was a direct contrast to rivals like Lamborghini and Ferrari that had bigger engines but bigger cars. Lotus was all about tiny, and in fact, the Esprit came out in 1976. And for the first 20 years of its life, it was sold with a 4-cylinder engine, not a V6, V8, a 4-cylinder. And when this car first came out, it had only 140 horsepower, but that was okay because the original Esprit weighed under 2,000 pounds. Now, as the Esprit aged and rivals started getting more powerful and the Esprit started adding more equipment, it needed more and more power. And so by the end of the 4-cylinder era, the Esprit had 300 horsepower from a turbo 4-cylinder, which was pretty respectable, but it still wasn't a V8. That came for the 1996 model year, and it was on all later Esprits after that, this 99 of course included. It was a twin-turbo V8, and here it made 350 horsepower, which was a pretty healthy figure, particularly considering this vehicle's weight. Even though it's not as light as early Esprits, it still weighs under 3,000 pounds, which is pretty good for a relatively modern exotic car. The result was 0 to 60 in the low 4-second range, which was pretty fast, especially in the mid-late 90s when these V8 Esprits came out. Now, in addition to adding the V8 to these later Esprits, Lotus also made some cosmetic changes on the outside to distinguish the V8 models from earlier ones. My favorite is the dancing V8 badge. As you can see, it looks cool and also pretty 90s, but it did let you know, hey, the Lotus Esprit finally doesn't have a 4-cylinder anymore. This thing is a real V8. Now, the V8 in this car is, of course, mid-mounted, as you can see, directly behind the passenger compartment, and it shares this rear compartment with storage back here. There's a pretty decent storage space in back where you can put a decent amount of stuff. Surprisingly practical, surprisingly sizable, despite the fact that the engine and the storage compartment both share the same spot. Now, getting into this rear compartment is a little bit unusual. There's a latch in the driver's door jamb. You can see it right here, and you pull on it to access the rear compartment. That's not all that strange. The weird part is, if you pull it halfway, one of the rear compartment latches releases. If you pull it the rest of the way, the other side also releases. So you pull it halfway for one, the full way for both, in order to get into the rear compartment, which is a little unusual. But that's nowhere near as strange as opening up the fuel door. This is the fuel door in the Lotus Esprit, which isn't all that unusual. It's in a similar spot to a lot of cars, located right there. Pretty standard, except there's another one over on the other side. So you have 2 fuel doors, one on each side. We'll get back to that in a second. The stranger part, believe it or not, is how you access the fuel door. You look around the interior and there's no immediately obvious release. You can't see it anywhere. The driver's footwell, there's no button in the center console, the center control stack. How do you open the fuel door? I worked at an exotic car dealership in the 2000s, and one of these came in and I had to go get fuel for it. So I drive to the gas station and I couldn't figure out how to open the fuel door. This was in the days before cell phones were rampant, so I had to drive all the way back to the dealership, ask somebody, and then return to the gas station. situation because it's impossible to find. The answer is it's in the center console, but here, unlabeled and hidden under this little hump in the center console, kind of facing the center control stack. That button you push, and then the fuel door opens. Very strange placement. But when you open the fuel door, you can see only one side opens, the driver's side, because that's the only actual fuel door. Early Esprit models had fuel doors on both sides, driver and passenger, and you could choose where you wanted to add the fuel. But later ones like this just consolidated it onto one side like a normal car. So it's right here. And speaking of weird opening things, let's talk about the front compartment. In your car, you want to get under the hood in front. There's a latch in the driver footwell you pull, and then another one in front. Pretty simple. In this car, it is not so simple. There is a little wire piece in the driver's footwell that makes kind of a U shape. And to get into the front compartment, you push that forward all the way, and once it's in the most forward position, then the front compartment is unlatched, and you can walk up and just open it right up. And when you get under here, you can see, well, it's not exactly a storage compartment, it's mostly mechanical stuff. You have a spare tire under here, you have your fuses, some fluids, but that's how you access the front compartment in your Lotus Esprit. The stranger part is actually getting it closed. You gotta close the front compartment, and you can't slam it down because it doesn't close. It's not ready to do that. Instead, you get it to this position where it's sitting on the latches that close it. Then you go back into the driver's footwell and you pull that U-shaped wire back towards you, and that clamps down on the front compartment and actually closes it. It's a very strange operation, but this is a very strange car. And speaking of strange, this is a Lotus Esprit, so there is still much more strange to cover. One interesting quirk of this car is the key fob. It has keyless entry, which means you push a button, the door unlocks, which is great, but this is the key fob. It looks absolutely bizarre. For one thing, there's a piece of rubber that connects it to your keychain, which seems weird, but that's the situation. You also have two unlabeled buttons, different sized ovals, and despite that, the one on the left does both lock and unlock. The one on the right, I think, is for the alarm, but regardless, the one on the left lock and unlock. And of course, there's no indication of whether you've locked it or unlocked it, so you have to just tap the same button to do whatever the opposite is of the thing you just did. That is certainly an unusual key fob for an unusual car. And then there's the parking brake, which is located here, to the left of the driver, rather than in the center like virtually every other car. That is strange, but the operation of it is even stranger. If you want the parking brake on, you pull it up like in every other car, but then if it stayed up, it would get in your way when you're trying to climb in and out of the car. So after it's up and engaged, you can push it down so it's away. Then you can climb in and out of the car easier, but you're left with an interesting conundrum. You don't really know if the parking brake is engaged or not, because to turn it off, you lift it back up and then push it back down, and now it's off. So when it's down, it can be either on or off, depending on what you've done before that. There's just no way to know from looking at it, which is certainly unusual. And then there's the roof situation, which frankly is actually pretty cool. There are 3 different roof options for this Esprit. Right now you can see the glass roof is on and in place, which is kind of a neat look. If you want to have sun come through the top, that's pretty cool. But you can also remove this glass roof entirely. Then you have an open panel directly above you, so it's like you have a T-top and you have the wind blowing in your hair, which is very nice. But there's also a third option, which is a body-colored hardtop. If you are a grumpy sourpuss and you don't want to have the air blowing or see the sun, you can put on the body-colored hardtop and then sit in a true coupe with no exterior lighting or wind coming through the roof at all. By the way, worth pointing out that that hardtop can stow inside the trunk, so you can drive along and make decisions about exactly what you want your top situation to be whenever you're cruising. And next up, another notable item of the Esprit is, frankly, just the way it looks. I love how exotic sports car the Esprit looks. I think it's fantastic. It's low, it's wide, which you can see in the back, 2 very important traits of an exotic car, but up front, that continues where you have this incredibly flat windshield. This is something you notice after spending some time with Esprits. There's no curvature at all. It's just totally flat, this panel of glass in the windshield. And I think that helps contribute to the wedge shape in front. You have a flat windshield, which turns into a flat front panel, and that goes down almost to a point in the front. Wedge in the front, wide, low. It really does have the look of a true exotic car, which is what it is. Now, one big reason for the Esprit's wedge shape is that up front, it has pop-up headlights. You can see right now they're down. You don't have any visible headlight, but you go to turn the headlights on and they pop right up and then illuminate whatever's in front of you. This was a very common feature on sports cars in the late 1970s throughout the 1980s, but it was pretty much gone by the time this Esprit was sold new in 1999. But this car still had it because it had its design roots in the 1970s and 1980s. That's when the Esprit came out, and it was never fully redesigned, so they never got rid of the pop-ups. In fact, the Lotus Esprit was the second to last car ever to offer pop-up headlights. It was made with pop-ups all the way through 2004, and so was the C5 Chevy Corvette. But the Esprit went out of production in February of 2004, and the C5 Corvette went out that summer, so technically that was the last car with pop-ups, and this was second. But indeed, when the Esprit first came out, they gave it an exotic look. Also giving this one an exotic look are these wheels. You can see these OZ racing wheels. They almost look aftermarket, but they were in fact a factory option. There was a standard wheel, or you could pay extra to get these cool ones. And I know that because I have the window sticker right here. This is the original window sticker for this Esprit V8. And you can see the OZ racing wheels are $1,500 extra. The glass roof is only $695 extra, which to me actually seems like kind of a bargain, frankly. You wouldn't get away with that today. It would be thousands and thousands of dollars in some special exclusive option. But here's the rest of the window sticker. One thing I like is how they intentionally designed the upper part with all the features to sort of spread itself around the Lotus logo in the center. The longer ones are on the top, the shorter ones are on the bottom to make room so that you can see the Lotus logo, which is really kind of stupid, probably a waste of someone's time. Now you can also see the sticker price here, over $88,000 back when this car was new. That was big money back in '99. It really was the price you paid for an exotic sports car with a twin-turbo V8. But one thing that doesn't feel very exotic car expensive is the sheer amount of parts sharing that this car has. Lotus then, and today, frankly, didn't really have all that much money. So they tried to share and reuse parts with other automakers whenever it was possible in order to save money in developing the parts themselves. And that led to some rather hilarious shared parts in this car, my very favorite of which is the steering wheel. This is the Lotus Esprit steering wheel, as you can see. But it was borrowed from General Motors, who also used it in Saturns. This steering wheel was in the Saturn SC and the SL when those cars first came out in the late 80s and early 90s. You can see it here in a Saturn. This was the base model, entry-level, $9,000 new Saturn, shared its steering wheel with the Lotus Esprit. And there was much more. You had a generic power mirror switch, as you can see here, that was used in a lot of cars from this era. Same deal with the window switches. You can see them here in the center. Again, generic and shared with a lot of other cars. The buttons here in the center to turn on the hazard lights, the fog lights, that sort of thing, those are borrowed from Peugeot, and they were used in the Peugeot 106, which was the very entry-level, cheapest economy car Peugeot, shared those buttons with the mighty Lotus Esprit. The odometer in the gauge cluster is completely generic and was used in several different cars. I have the exact same odometer in my old Land Rover Defender. And earlier Lotus Esprit models borrowed their rear view mirrors from a Citroën. The Citroën CX, which was just sort of a standard commuter car, shared its mirrors with earlier Lotus Esprits. However, probably the greatest and most ridiculous example of this car's part sharing comes from the taillights, which were borrowed from the Toyota Corolla. The 1980s Toyota Corolla has these horizontal taillights with vertical bars, as you can see, and they were also used on the Esprit. Beginning in the 80s and all the way through the end of production in 2004, the Lotus Esprit borrowed Toyota Corolla taillights. There were quite a few examples of part sharing in this car, and these are just the ones I noticed. There are probably quite a bit more because Lotus just didn't have the money to develop their own versions of a lot of this stuff. And indeed, Lotus's financial situation is pretty clear throughout the rest of this interior as well, because frankly, it's pretty basic. You don't have all that much in here. For instance, there's no glove box over on the passenger side, and there's no center console storage area. Not a lot of in-cabin storage. The only piece you have is between the seat backs. As you can see here, you can stick paperwork and other items for storage. Now, it's worth pointing out that you did have the essentials in here. For example, you had air conditioning. So even though this car was all about lightweight and stripped to the bare essentials, air conditioning was included, which was nice. You also had leather upholstery, as you can see, leather seats with nice red piping that made it at least competitive with exotic cars from its time period, even though they didn't want to go full Italian leather luxury like some Esprit rivals. And of course, also included in this interior, you have ashtrays, driver and passenger side, because you simply couldn't have a European car from this era and not have dual ashtrays so that everyone could smoke, because that was of utmost importance at the time. By the way, also worth noting in this interior, I showed you that in this sort of hidden area in the center console, it's where the fuel door release is, but you have some other controls in here too. One of them is this button. That is the power window lockout. So if you want to prevent your passenger from rolling up and down the window, you just tap that button and then they can't do that. Now, the interesting thing is this window lockout is actually more reachable by the passenger than the window switch itself, so they could just turn it right back on, but they never will, because finding the window lockout is very difficult and no one will ever find it there. Now, you also have a little dial here. This is your dimmer for your interior lights. You can twist it to the left or right to brighten or dim the lights in the gauge cluster and the center control stack. And I learned this, by the way, from the owner's manual, which is here, merely a binder that happens to be Lotus branded with all of the Lotus Esprit owner's manual info in it. Not particularly large like modern car owner's manuals, but relatively useful, and it explains everything about the Esprit. All right, driving the Lotus Esprit V8. I've wanted to review one of these for a long time. I really love this car. And now I finally am. Now, I really do love this car. I told the story that I worked at an exotic car dealership years ago, and we had one of these on the lot, and that's true. It was Ferrari of Denver, and we were trying to sell like a 2000 or a 2001. This was an 06. And I drove it and thought it was the coolest thing in the world. Now, it's not as beautiful on the inside as Ferraris from this era, a 355 or a 360, and it's a Lotus. Part support isn't the same, and reliability is questionable, but it was just so much fun to drive, and it looked so much more exotic. This car almost has like a Lamborghini Countach Ferrari Testarossa type look with a wide, flat, wedge shape. Like, this really looks the part of a true exotic car. It just happens to be a Lotus and not a, Ferrari or Lamborghini, so it's just not as well known. But not only does it look cool, it actually drives shockingly well. That's one of the things that I most love about the Esprit, and particularly the V8 Esprit. Flooring it right now, and it hauls! Woo! Like hauls. Like normal actual people who have been in actual fast cars would think this is fast. You don't have a lot of turbo lag. The V8 has a ton of power. It really throws you back. It's got good performance. Now, I am a big supporter of Lotus's belief that, take a lightweight car, put a small engine in it, and it's just as fun as a fast, big, powerful car. But what's really fun is when you put a bigger engine in a lightweight car, and that's kind of what this is. Under 3,000 pounds with a 3.5-liter V8 that does 350 horsepower. I mean, this car is quick, and because it's so light and so little and so low, it feels quick. Like, you're low, you're close to the road, you feel like you're really going fast, because you are. It's a lot of fun. Now, important to point out, this car is also a Lotus, which means that steering and handling is also going to be a big positive, and indeed that is the case. This car feels tight and fun to throw around. It is quite well balanced. Steering is very precise. It's interesting because more and more modern cars have this level of amazing steering precision, even if they're SUVs. But back in the 90s, you kind of had to get a car like this to get that sort of immediate feel when you turn the steering wheel, that sort of connection that you have, like a quick input makes a quick movement with the car. And this car has that, and it feels great. It's also very well balanced, and I will say, because it's so low, because it's mid-engine, it is very flat in corners. You're really not getting pushed around when you go around corners. It doesn't rotate a lot. It feels flat. It feels like it should, like a sports car should. Now, I want to address the two flaws with this car, or the two potential flaws. One is interior size. Now, I'm pretty tall, 6'3", 6'4", and it's tight in here. I can make it work, but if I sit back, my head is close to the ceiling, I can't see traffic lights, my knee is right up against the dashboard and the steering wheel, the pedal box is pretty narrow for big feet, it's tight. It's not as bad as an Elise or an Exige. This is a larger, kind of more flagship type car, but it's still tight in this interior, so that's one issue. The other issue is, of course, reliability. Now, the owner of this car is a mechanic who maintains it. It doesn't seem to have any issues. Drives fantastically. Even around the car, stuff closes correctly and turns on correctly. The pop-ups work, etc., etc. But that's a fear, because Lotus doesn't have the parts availability, the brand support that a lot of other brands have, even exotic brands. And I think that's one of the reasons why these have depreciated, in my opinion, further than they should. You look at Countach's, are $1 million car now. This is still in the $50,000, $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 range. And it's kind of a bargain, but I think that fear of reliability is something that scares a lot of people, and one big reason why these haven't taken off. And of course, in that respect, your mileage may vary. I make no claims about what's gonna happen next, but when it is running, it's a pretty good car. And this is a nice example, 30,000 miles, 2 owners. Current guy's had it for 3 years, bought it from the original owner. So it's like relatively nice as these go. Overall, I gotta say, I just love this car. I think this car is so cool. I'm disappointed that it's never gotten a lot of, oh yeah, woohoo! I'm disappointed that it's never gotten a lot of love. Some enthusiasts are really, really into it, but it's certainly more like esoteric and obscure than a lot of special sports cars that everybody loves, like Ferraris and Corvettes and all that. But it's still cool, and it drives great. And I just think it's awesome. And I've always wanted to review it, and I'm thrilled that I had the chance to do that, especially a nice one like this. And so that's the Lotus Esprit V8. I know everybody's afraid of reliability with these cars. That's a totally legitimate fear, but I love this car. I love how it looks. I love how it drives. It is just so cool. And frankly, I think that it's kind of underappreciated and underrated. You can buy this one on Cars and Bids. Anyway, now it's time to give the Esprit V8 a DOUGSCORE. And the DOUGSCORE is here, 55 out of 100, which places the Esprit here against some of its contemporaries near the bottom, although this is a very competitive list that includes some really crazy cars like the Lamborghini Diablo and the Porsche 911 GT2. The Esprit actually does very well in the weekend categories, beating out the 996 Porsche 911 Carrera 4S and the Acura NSX, but it's the daily categories where it falters. No surprise, as it's a small, kind of cramped interior and reliability is a concern. Still, I think the Esprit V8 is undervalued and special, and if you're not using it for daily activities, it's a seriously head-turning and exciting car.